Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today for this wonderful edition of Baha'i Chat, where we will be talking about spiritual solutions to our social problems. It's going to be a fantastic conversation that we're going to have today with Bob Henderson, and we're just so honored that all of you have joined us. Baha'i Chat is dedicated to having conversations about our interconnectedness, about our oneness, and about our unity. We are committed to addressing America's most vital and challenging issue, which the Baha'i writings say is racism. Baha'i Chat is that uplifting moment where we are addressing the world's ills through a spiritual lens. When I was praying and meditating about this morning, what came to me was a Western scholar who was from Cambridge University, who was a professor, who had the opportunity to visit Baha'u'llah in 1890, in April of 1890. He said, "The face of him on whom I gazed, I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. Those piercing eyes seemed to read one's very soul. Power and authority sat on that ample brow. No need to ask in whose presence I stood. As I bowed myself before one who is the object of a devotion and love, which kings might envy and emperors sigh for in vain." During that meeting, Baha'u'llah shared in an encapsulation what the Baha'i Faith really stands for. And in that meeting, he said to Edward Granville Brown, "Praise be to God that thou hast attained. Thou hast come to see a prisoner and an exile. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations. Yet they deem us up as stirs of strife and sedition worthy of bondage and banishment. That all nations should become one in faith, and all men as brothers. That the bonds of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened. That diversity of religion should cease, and differences of race be annulled. What harm is there in this? Yet so it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. Do not you in Europe need this also? Is not that which Christ foretold? Yet do we see your kings and rulers lavishing their treasures more freely on means for the destruction of the human race than on that which would conduce to the happiness of mankind. These strifes and this bloodshed and discord must cease, and all men be as one kindred and one family. Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind." So, without further ado, I wanted to introduce you to Bob Henderson. Bob, thank you so much for joining us. So honored to have you.
Good to be here.
Mr. Henderson holds a degree in psychology. He retired from law enforcement after 26 years of service. He is a passionate advocate for social justice and has dedicated his life to the study of African American history and training diverse groups to understand, from a historical perspective, why we continue to have a different criminal justice system, two of them, one for Blacks and one for whites, as well as law enforcement's role in building trust with their respective communities. Bob, you and I have a little in common. I actually, too, My educational background is in African American studies. And I always knew that we could not truly end racism in America without understanding the historical trauma that has happened and the psychological impact that it's had on us all. So we seem to be two peas in one pod. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Faith, for the introduction, and thank all of you for attending today's our session today in chat. I'd like to also thank David Hoffman and Josefina Hernandez for also organizing this. So thanks so much. So I do have a slide presentation to share with everyone. But first, just as an observation, as one surveys the conditions and challenges we all face today in the modern world, it is quite evident that humanity as a whole is in need of finding new methods of collaborating and priority setting. We are challenged to rethink the age-old assumptions about the nature of progress, the administration of justice, and the basis of international peace. We are challenged to find actual answers to end war, to eliminate all forms of prejudice, which is eating into the vitals of every society. We are challenged to find ways and means to protect our natural environment from absolute destruction. The pandemic, of course, has exposed many pre-existing social factors that need to be addressed. And at the most foundational level, we are challenged to find a global ethic or unifying vision of the nature of man and society, a vision that will enable each and every one of us to advance human civilization as well as to partake of its benefits. Now, remarkably, the first to address these issues was not a contemporary thinker or statesman, but rather was a Persian nobleman in the mid-19th century named Baha'u'llah, which is an Arabic title that means the glory of God. And today, in my presentation, I'd like to share with you some of the spiritual principles and concepts that will lead ultimately to what Baha'is believe is the oneness of humanity. And when you think about where we are in history at this time, particularly the advancements throughout the 20th century, particularly in areas of communication and transportation, really has fused the entire planet into one neighborhood. And so global integration today is a reality. Yeah. So how do we grapple with this? How do we understand where we are in history, and what are the new principles and international laws that we can sort of discuss and talk about to bring about? Because what this signifies, and for many people, particularly Baha'is, is that the age-old dream of world peace is not only today possible, but it's also inevitable. The topic today is creating a just and peaceful world community. Many believe, as well as I do, that it is unrealistic to imagine that the vision of the next stage in our collective evolution can be formulated without an unbiased re-examination of the attitudes, concepts, and assumptions that currently underlie approaches to how we have structured our world, both socially and economically. Conflict and competition have essentially become the mainsprings of human interactions. This materialistic conception of human nature has created habits and has built institutions over the centuries which have exceeded their effectiveness. Only through the dawning consciousness of the oneness of humanity, which embraces our unity and diversity, can old habits and patterns be transformed into new ways of behaving and thinking, which would then be based on collaboration and conciliation. Although seemingly simple in public discourse, the spiritual principle of the oneness of humanity presents fundamental challenges to the way most of our contemporary institutions function today. I'd like to give you an example of why we need to re-examine the concepts, assumptions, and attitudes behind how we have structured our entire world. And this is just one example. Herbert Spencer, an English philosopher born in 1820 in England, took the concept of Darwin regarding natural selection and falsely applied them to human beings. Spencer then created a theory called social Darwinism, whereby superior physical force shapes history, rationalizing imperialism, colonialism, racism, and poverty. Spencer was the one who actually coined the term survival of the fittest, and it was not Charles Darwin. Now, social Darwinism led to the Eugenics project in this country during the early part of the 20th century, which was if you don't know about this was the compulsory sterilization of people of color and other undesirable, so-called undesirables in an effort to rid them from society. Social Darwinism was further perfected here in the United States and was used by Hitler to justify atrocities against the Jews during World War II. So as we navigate through my slide presentation, you will see why it's necessary, absolutely necessary, to re-examine all of the concepts, attitudes, and assumptions in contemporary society. For those who may not be aware, there is a twofold process occurring in the world today, which I want to share with you. And I'll begin with this quotation from the Baha'i writings, which state, "We are indeed living in an age which, if we could correctly appraise it, should be regarded as one which is witnessing a dual phenomena. The first signalizes the death pangs of an order, effete and godless, that has stubbornly refused, despite the signs and portents of a century-old revelation, to attune its processes to the precepts and ideals which that heaven-sent faith proffered it. The second proclaims the birth pangs of an order, divine and redemptive, that will inevitably supplant the former, and within whose administrative structure an embryonic civilization, incomparable and world-embracing, is imperceptibly maturing. The one is being rolled up and is crashing in oppression, bloodshed, and ruin. The other opens up vistas of a justice, a unity, a peace, a culture, such as no age has ever seen." So folks, I just want to share with you, maybe to use some sort of example or analogy around this. We're in a type of, you could say, spiritual springtime, when the cold of winter, the icy coldness of winter, is being replaced by new life. And so there's this twofold process. When you think about spring, there's this sort of twofold process. It's the end of one season, winter, and the opening up of spring and eventually summer. So we're in this midst, we're kind of an odd, interesting place in history, because we have an old ways of thinking, behaving, old institutions that are now faced with new ways of thinking, new ways of being, new ways of behaving, that's in contrast to the new ways of functioning today. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. And if we're going to talk about peace in any sort, I think it is the essential concept that is necessary. It's this one from Baha'u'llah. The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are absolutely unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. This unity can never be achieved so long as the counsels which the pen of the Most High revealed are suffered to pass unheeded. So here's my take and understanding of this. We all long for world peace, right? And no one would deny that or say they don't want that worldwide peace. But what Baha'u'llah is saying here is that there is a prerequisite to peace, and that prerequisite is establishing bonds and principles of unity. So here are some of the basic principles of unity of the Baha'i Faith, and I don't have time today to go into each one in great detail. I'll just mention what they are, and I'll highlight some of them more in detail as we go through the presentation. But some of the basic unifying principles of the Baha'i Faith is the oneness of God. There's only one God. The essential unity of religion. Baha'is believe that all religion comes from one source, that is God, and is part of a single process, so that we cherish equally all the major religions of God. The unity of mankind, right? And all of the sciences confirm that we are one people. Equality of men and women, elimination of all forms of prejudice, harmony of religion and science, independent investigation of truth, the need for universal compulsory education to unlock everyone's capacity, the need for a universal auxiliary language, obedience to government and non-involvement in partisan politics, elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty. So we can see, and I think it'd be hard for most folks to deny the necessity of implementing all of these unifying principles in society today. And so this is the great effort being made today by many. And I just want to point out that when we don't have a unified world, the result is disunity, right? And some of the impacts and effects of disunity we can see in the world today, and we can particularly see it in areas of wealth inequality. So here we have this information here that states that 8 men own the same wealth as the 3.6 billion people who make up the poorest half of humanity. So we can see how the world is very disordered. You have 8 people owning more wealth than half of the world's population. And 5 out of the 8 are Americans. So it's the way this system is structured creates these inequalities that we need to address throughout the program. In 1867, Baha'u'llah, who saw way ahead of humanity, began writing letters to the rulers and kings of his day, addressing issues of our collective security. He pointed out the necessity to consult as a primary means to creating and maintaining a just and peaceful world community. He was essentially giving the world leaders at that time an opportunity to establish the age-old dream of peace, of world peace, to which they all rejected. And the only one who had a kindly response to Baha'u'llah was Queen Victoria of England, who said, if this is of God, it will endure, and if not, it can do no harm. And I'd like to share this particular powerful quote from Baha'u'llah, where he's addressing, he's forward thinking, he's thinking way ahead of humanity, and he's acknowledging this necessity of nations coming together. And here's what he wrote. The time must come when the imperative necessity for the holding of a vast and all-embracing assemblage of men will be universally realized. The rulers and kings of the earth must needs attend it, and participating in its deliberations must consider such ways and means as will lay the foundation of the world's great peace amongst men. Such a peace demandeth that the great powers should resolve, for the sake of the tranquility of the peoples of the earth, to be fully reconciled among themselves. Should any king take up arms against another, all should unitedly rise and prevent him. If this be done, the nations of the world will no longer require any armaments, except for the purpose of preserving the security of their realms and of maintaining internal order within their territories. This will ensure the peace and composure of every people, government, and nation. We had the United Nations, right, today, which is the one agency on whom had devolved the task of liberating the promotion of human rights from those who exploit it in the United Nations, which came into existence, as you guys know, in 1945, but only after 2 world wars. And this was 78 years after Baha'u'llah had written to all the world leaders at that time, advising them of the world of a commonwealth of nations, which was needed after much, great suffering. So we know today that, as Baha'is believe, that because today the world peace has been invested with divine authority by Baha'u'llah, it cannot be stopped. It will occur either through a sequence of consequences due to our stubborn clinging to old patterns of behavior, or through the consultative process where we merely choose peace. And we can see world peace, excuse me, oddly, mysteriously, and slowly occurring through a sequence of consequences. We consider what happened during World War I. We saw the League of Nations, and then afterwards we saw during World War II, the further blossoming of the League of Nations and to the more broadly based United Nations we have today, with all of its international agencies currently serving as a type of planetary civil service for all humanity. But there is a much easier way that Baha'u'llah is suggesting, as he had mentioned to the world leaders back at his time, that there's a consultative process that doesn't involve warfare and tribulation and conflict, that it can be done through a different method. But at least we're at this point on the right track with the United Nations, forming what Baha'u'llah talked about in 1867. And I wanted to briefly share with you the 17 sustainable goals of the UN. And these Sustainable Development Goals were set up in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly and are intended to be achieved by the year 2030. What inspires me is a quote from Baha'u'llah, a couple of quotes from Baha'u'llah, when he wrote, he said, quote, "Let your vision be world embracing rather than confined to yourself." He also said, quote, "The earth is but one country and mankind its citizens," end quote. So it's important for all of us to kind of know what's happening worldwide, since we're one human family. So I want to just, I can't speak too long on any one of these because there's 17 and I have other things to cover, but I want to just briefly share with you that some of the goals of the UN is in line with this idea of working together as one universal family, and in line with all of the Baha'i writings. And there's an organization as part of the UN called the Baha'i International Community that works hand in hand with the UN and presenting a lot of the Baha'i concepts to them. So the end of poverty is one of the goals, is end poverty in all of its forms everywhere. So more than 700 million people still live in extreme poverty and less than, let's say, $2 a day. And they struggle to fulfill most of their basic needs: health, education, access to water and sanitation. Number 2, end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. So more than 750 million people suffer from hunger worldwide, and the vast majority are in developing countries. This number is expected to go up by over 100 million in 2020 alone due to COVID-19. Ensure healthy lives, promote well-being for all ages. So despite great strides in improving people's health in recent years, inequalities in healthcare access still persists. The COVID-19 pandemic is throwing progress even further off track. More than 5 million children die before their 5th birthday every year. I'll repeat that. More than 5 million children die before their 5th birthday every year. 16,000 children die each year from preventable diseases such as measles and tuberculosis. Every day, hundreds of women die during pregnancy or from childbirth related to complications. Number 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education, promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Today, 250 million children and youth of age 6 to 17 were still out of school in 2018, and more than half of children and adolescents are not meeting minimal proficiency standards in reading and mathematics. Number 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Women and girls represent half of the world's population and therefore also half of its potential, but gender inequality persists everywhere and stagnates social progress. On average, women in labor markets still earn 23% less than men globally. On average, women spend about 3 times as many hours in unpaid domestic and care work as men. Sexual violence, exploitation, the unequal division of unpaid care and domestic work, and discrimination in public office all remain huge barriers. All these areas of inequality have are exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Access to water, sanitation, and hygiene is a human right, but yet billions are still faced with deadly challenges accessing even the most basic of services. Water scarcity affects more than 40% of the world population, is projected to increase with the rise of global temperatures as a result of climate change. Things will likely get worse. 7, ensure that access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Our everyday life depends on reliable and affordable energy, and yet the consumption of energy is the dominant contributor to climate change, accounting for about 60% of total global greenhouse gas emission. Promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. The global unemployment rate in 2019 was 5%, down from 6.4 in 2020. However, COVID-19 could cause the equivalent of 400 million job losses in 2020. Build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Global manufacturing slowed in both developing and developed regions in 2018 and 2019, mainly attributed to emerging trade and tariff barriers that constrain investment and future growth. This plummeted in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. Reduce inequality within and among countries. Income inequality is on the rise, particularly within countries. As of 2017, the richest 10% earn at least 20% of total global income. The poorest 40% earn less than 25% of total global income. So we can see this discrepancy here, and this picture kind of says it all. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Half of the world's population live in cities, and it is estimated that by 2050, 6.5 billion people, 2/3 of humanity, will live in urban areas. So this is a challenge to develop these areas to make it sustainable. 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. If the global population reaches 9.8 billion by 2050, the equivalent of almost 3 planets will be required to provide the natural resources needed to sustain current lifestyles. 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. Climate change affects every country on every continent. It is a cause of human activities and threatens the future of our planet. With rising greenhouse gas emissions, climate change is occurring at the rates much faster than anticipated, and its effects are clearly felt worldwide. You can see that certainly in this country. Number 14, conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Oceans cover 3/4 of the Earth's surface and contains 9% of the Earth's water and represents 99% of the living space on the planet by volume. The world's oceans provide key natural resources, including food, medicine, biofuels, and other products, help with the breakdown and removal of waste and pollution, and their coastal ecosystems act as buffers to reduce damage from storms. Today, more than 30% of the world's fish stocks are overexploited, and marine pollution is reaching alarming levels, with an average of 13,000 pieces of plastic litter to be found on every square kilometer of ocean. 15, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat deforestation, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. 16, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, and provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. People everywhere should be free of fear from all forms of violence and feel safe as they go about their lives, whatever their ethnicity, faith, or sexual orientation. And lastly, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is universal and calls for action by all countries, developed and developing, to ensure no one is left behind. It requires partnership between governments, the private sector, and civil society. The Sustainable Development Goals can only be realized with a strong commitment to global partnership and cooperation. Now I want to share with you, to bring it home, one of America's most vital and challenging issues, which is racism. In the Baha'i Faith, before I read this, I will share with you that America, it says, will lead all nations spiritually. But in our writings, it also talks about there's some spiritual prerequisites before this could even happen, which is a rectitude of conduct, a holy and chaste life, and indiscriminating racial fellowship. So the specific things that we need to overcome as a nation before we can lead all nations spiritually. And our writings state also that America is prey to one of the most virulent and long-standing forms of racial prejudice. And maybe during the Q&A, we'll talk more about that, why that is the case, right? Why this country struggles so heavily, mightily with this issue. And it states here in the quote that from the day it was born, the United States embraced a set of contradictory values. The founding fathers proclaimed their devotion to the highest principles of equality and justice, yet enshrined slavery in the Constitution. Slavery poisoned the mind and heart of the nation, would not be abolished without a bloody civil war that nearly destroyed the young republic. The evil consequences of slavery are still visible in this land. They continue to affect the behavior of both Black and white Americans, and prevent the healing of old wounds. And for those who believe we live in a post-racist society, let me just share with you that the spiritual cancer of racism, which is at the heart of it, it's racial superiority, right? A belief in that, and also a belief in Black inferiority. And this has really infused itself into all of our institutions, which is called structural racism, which is an analytical approach that examines the interrelationship among all the institutions for generating an understanding of the reproduction of unequal racial outcomes. Structural racism takes into account the past 4 centuries of systemic injustice. So when one views our institutions in isolation from the history of this country, that acts as a hindrance to understanding. So you must include the entire history of the US to understand what is structural racism, and how all of these institutions work together and are creating outcomes that are not favorable for people of color in particular. And to give you an example of this sort of cause and effect of this illness called racism, let me just share with you very briefly, the United States prison population has increased 700% in the last 40 years. And if you examine this graph, it reflects that a large number of people are, if you kind of understand who's actually in our prisons, are primarily people of color. And they're being moved, and they were moved like this sort of this all at once into this sort of system. And we have to ask ourselves what actually occurred during this time between the sort of the early part of 1970s and moving up. We saw this sort of spike in the prison population. And for those who aren't aware, this is called the prison industrial complex, which explains the rapid expansion of the United States inmate population with private prison companies and businesses that supply goods and services to government prison agencies for profit. And for those who know the history, this was the prison industrial complex occurred as a result, sort of a pushback from the gains made during the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So as Blacks and other minorities had gained some social status, this was the result, the pushback against that. And who's making money off of these prisons? Well, there are corporations that are doing this. Corrections Corporation of America, also called CCA, which is now called Core Civic, which owns and manages private prisons and detention centers. Actually was founded in 1983. Look at the volume of money that is made in these private prisons. Revenue gross 1.79 billion in 2015, while GEO revenue gross 1.84. So basically, this country made a business rather, out of imprisoning folks. When you look at how America stands in relationship to other countries, out of every 693 folks, or out of every 100,000 people, 693 are actually incarcerated. And again, the majority of the folks in our prisons are people of color. The US accounts for 5% of the world's population and 20% of all people in prison in the world. Today, 2.3 million people are in prison in the United States. And although comprising only 30% of the United States population, 1 million are African American. If nothing changes, 1 in 3 Black males born in the United States today will go to prison compared to 1 in 17 whites. Minorities are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they're more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they're more likely to face sentences. So now we're going to move from all of these social ills, which is quite depressing, but is a reality that we all face today, with the spiritual solutions to these things that provided within the Baha'i writings. And I think when one ponders deeply and fairly upon the conditions of our world, it becomes apparent that the principal cause of suffering in our world today is due to the spiritual disorientation that has led to the corruption of human morals and the prevalence of all forms of prejudice. The solution is spiritual and begins with a reconceptualization of ourselves as spiritual beings. Our value is intrinsic, and not extrinsic. So let me just share with you a couple of quotes in Baha'i writings. Man should know his own self and know those things which lead to loftiness or to abasement, to shame or to poverty, to wealth or to poverty. And man's merit lieth in service and virtue, not in the pageantry of wealth and riches. So being in a materialistic society, we are told our value is predominantly materialistic, right? Things that you own, things that you possess. We need to have a redefinition of who we are as human beings. We are spiritual beings, and our merit lies in our qualities and in our service to humanity. And I'd like to share also this quote here, that there are spiritual principles of what some call human values by which solutions can be found for every social problem. Any well-intentioned group can in a general sense devise practical solutions to its problems, but good intentions and practical knowledge are usually not enough. The essential merit of spiritual principle is that it not only presents a perspective which harmonizes with that which is immanent in human nature, it also induces an attitude, a dynamic, a will, and an aspiration which facilitate the discovery and implementation of practical measures. Leaders of government and all in authority would do well served in their efforts to solve problems if they would first seek to identify the principles involved and then to be guided by them. So as I'm going to share with you as we move forward on this, let's make examples of spiritual principles that have been redefined for our contemporary thinking that are essential to establishing a peaceful world. And some of these principles are the spiritual principle of the oneness of mankind, a redefinition of justice, and a redefinition of power. And understanding these new concepts is essential to achieving the 17 sustainable goals that I talked about, but also ultimately they're necessary to achieving and to building the kingdom of God on earth. So the primary question to be resolved today is this: how the present world with this entrenched pattern of conflict can be changed to a world in which harmony and cooperation will prevail. World order can be found only on an unshakable consciousness of the oneness of mankind, a spiritual truth which all the human sciences confirm. Anthropology, physiology, psychology recognize only one human species, albeit infinitely varied in the secondary aspects of life. Recognition of this truth requires abandonment of prejudice of every kind, race, class, color, creed, nation, sex, degree of material civilization, everything which enables people to consider themselves superior to others. So the first prerequisite to establishing the oneness of mankind is accepting this basic spiritual principle, which is really about the maturation, the transformation of our consciousness. When we look at the world today, we can clearly see that that basically with all of the structural injustices we see within our institutions, we can clearly see that we're operating on an incorrect ideology, operating in many nations on a racial hierarchy, and where there's people at the top and people at the very, very bottom. So if we're in all of our institutions, we're created sort of with that sort of false ideology. So if we're going to create a new world based on the principle of the oneness of mankind, it's going to require that we have a re-examination of all of our institutions and examine them very carefully to implement this new principle. And I wanted to share something that I think would be helpful, and it's oftentimes used in the Baha'i writings to have an understanding of this very powerful principle. And the human body is oftentimes used as a way to provide an analogy when we think about humanity as a whole. So think about the single body and what composes a single body. When you think about each cell in the body, like no cell in the body has any significance outside of the body that it's actually serving. So it's only in serving the body and receiving from the body that cell has significance, right? And so when we think about any cell that runs counter to this process of being reciprocal and serving the body, we give that a name, we call that cancer, right? So racism, an example, and all forms of prejudice are sort of a cancer to the body of humanity. And to give another example of this is, Jesus the Christ, when he and his followers weren't celebrating the Sabbath, and he was asked, why aren't you celebrating the Sabbath? He said that you don't put new wine in old wineskins. And I'll express why I'm sharing that right now. So we know about in the old world, right? So the way they made wine was they put grape juice in these wineskins, usually made out of sheepskin, and they would sew them up. And then as the fermentation occurred, it would expand the wineskins so it couldn't expand any further. So if you were to pour that wine out, put new wine in, you would burst the wineskins, and so both the wineskins and the wine itself would be lost. What was the point he was trying to make? So Christ had come at that time to bring in a new way of behaving, of thinking, that was counter to the prevalent ways of thinking. So in this age, Baha'u'llah has come and he has brought new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving that we need to embrace, and it won't fit into our old systems. And so this new wine I'm referring to today, just in terms of this analogy or metaphor, is the oneness of humanity. Right? And it's not going to fit into our current structures, our current institutions. They all have to be re-examined. They have to be recast, remodified, changed, however you want, amended, however you want to say it, reconceptualized, so that we can then embrace this powerful new ideology called the oneness of mankind. So acceptance of the oneness of mankind is the first fundamental prerequisite of reorganization and administration of the world as one country, the home of humankind. Universal acceptance of the spiritual principle is essential to any successful attempt to establish world peace. It should therefore be universally proclaimed, taught in schools, and constantly asserted in every nation as preparation for the organic change in the structures of society to which it implies. So another concept that has been redefined for us today is this concept of justice. Oftentimes justice today is viewed as those getting what they deserve. But what if you decide as those who are in charge of any particular society that there are those who are undeserving, right? So then the concept of justice doesn't fit to create a just world. So we need a new definition of justice. And here's what I believe is what would create this new world, which is the redefinition of justice, which is the light of men is justice. Quench it not with the contrary winds of oppression and tyranny. The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men. Verily I say, whatever is sent down from the heaven of the will of God is the means for the establishment of order in the world and the instrument for promoting unity and fellowship amongst his people. So the purpose of justice is unity. Now today, justice must include international laws and standards today that apply equally to all. And the purpose of which is to maintain, as I mentioned, unity. So the Declaration of Human Rights by the UN is a start, but the enforcement of those laws are not universally upheld. An example of this would be, and to give you like an example of this and some of the weaknesses of our UN currently, When you think about the Rwanda Genocide, which occurred between April 7th and July 15th, 1994, well, during that which is during the Rwandan Civil War, during that period, the members of the Tutsi minority group were slaughtered by armed militias. And the most widely accepted scholarly estimates are about 500 to 800,000 Tutsi deaths. And other estimates are as high as 1 million. Well, for those who aren't aware, that the first Genocide Convention was the first human rights treaty adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on 9 December 1948, and signified the international community's commitment to, quote, never again, right, after the atrocities committed during the Second World War. Yet the UN was unable to intervene with justice during the Rwanda crisis due to several factors involving the lack of unity. Because when you go back to the quote that Baha'u'llah talked about when he was referring to how do you create a world commonwealth, there's very specific things in there about creating forms of solidarity and unity among nations that will actually prevent those things from occurring. So at the group level, concern for justice is the indispensable compass in collective decision-making, because the only means by which unity of thought and action can actually be achieved. Far from encouraging the punitive spirit that is often masqueraded under its name in past ages, justice is the practical expression of awareness that in the achievement of human progress, the interests of the individual and those of society are inextricably linked. To the extent that justice becomes a guiding concern for human interaction, a consultative climate is encouraged that permits options to be examined dispassionately and appropriate course of action selected. In such a climate, the perennial tendencies toward manipulation and partnership are far less likely to deflect the decision-making process. So I wanted to just mention, when I remember earlier I used the analogy of the human body and how cells, so the body itself is an example of how justice operates. So each cell in the body both serves and receives from the body. So there's this reciprocal relationship. Well, in our society, when we think about our collective, the collective body of humanity, what keeps us interconnected is this concept of justice, which I think is better if you distinguish it from forgiveness. So when we think about forgiveness, forgiveness is what unites two people, right? Someone harms you in some way, forgiveness is required. But on a collective sense, it's justice is what unifies society. But we need the type of justice where everyone is treated fairly. All laws, international, national, local laws are fair and also applied equally to all. So when I looked up which is some of the most powerful countries in the world, of course, what came up was the United States, which is considered the most powerful country in the world because they have the most money and have the largest military at the end of their country in history. And America spent $725 billion on our national defense in 2020. So today, power is viewed as military might. But in the Baha'i writings, Baha'u'llah has radically given us a different definition of power. And when he wrote, it says, no power can exist except through unity. No welfare and no well-being can be attained except through consultation. He also said that so powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. So he's really given us redefining the word power for us in terms of, and giving us a new definition, that it's not in terms of the wealth that you own and the military might, because oftentimes today power is seen as people taking advantage of others, right? A means in which you can overcome and suppress others, right, for your own personal gain. But today, we need a different definition of power, which is actually in the word unity. And it's interesting that he's using the word light, because when you think about light, light is something that illuminates, right? It provides warmth, it provides guidance. So today we see we don't have unity in the world today as we should, at the level in which we should. And we see that the world is in a state of darkness, right? And so in a state of darkness, there's a disorientation to life at that point, right? So light is something that illuminates and provides guidance and structure for us. So Baha'u'llah also wrote these words too. He said, ever since the seeking of preference and distinction came into play, the world had been laid waste. It has become desolate. Those who have quaffed from the ocean of divine utterance and fixed their gaze upon the realm of glory should regard themselves as being on the same level as the others and in the same station, were this matter to be definitely established and conclusively demonstrated with the power and might of God, the world will become as an Alpha paradise, which is a reference to the kingdom of God on earth. And so I just wanted to share with you that this idea of us, trying to advance ourselves has been a primary cause of everyone sort of, living in a world today like we see today, which we see so much destruction as a result of the disunity that we see today. Baha'u'llah basically said that it's only through the power of unity that we can actually come together, and that no person should advance themselves over another person, right? So that's one of the basic tenets of the faith, that no one's superior to another person. As Baha'u'llah said, we've all been created from the same dust. So I just wanted to end with this slide here. I talked a lot about some of the social ills in society, and education is the key to a lot of these things. When I think about, for example, the criminal justice system and how we do things today, and how we've made arresting people a business. But here's an example of redefining how we even look at crime, and this will be the last slide that I'll share. It says, one thing remains to be said, is that the communities are day and night occupied in making penal laws and preparing and organizing instruments and means of punishment. They build prisons, make chains and fetters, arrange places of exile and banishment, and different kinds of hardships and tortures, and think by these means to discipline criminals, whereas in reality they are causing destruction of morals and the perversion of characters. The community, on the contrary, ought day and night to strive and endeavor with the utmost zeal and effort to accomplish the education of men, to cause them day and night to progress and to increase in science and knowledge, and to acquire virtues, to gain good morals, and to avoid vices, so that crimes may not occur. At the present time, the contrary prevails. The community is always thinking of enforcing the penal laws and of preparing means of punishment, instruments of death and chastisement, places for imprisonment and banishment, and they expect crimes to be committed. This has a demoralizing effect. But if the communities would endeavor to educate the masses, day by day, knowledge and sciences would increase, the understanding would be broadened, the sensibilities developed, customs would become good, and morals normal. In one word, all these classes and perfections, there would be progress, and there would be fewer crimes. So there's even a system for eliminating crimes today, and changing how we even look at our criminal justice system. So I'll end by stating that what we need is a real good balance between science and religion. So we know today that science is really sort of a practical instruments to bring the world together in many different ways and to serve humanity, right? Provides instruments of service. But what's also needed is the balance of religion. Religion provides the instructions for how we use science. So one is the tool and one is the instructions. And today, the religion is necessary to provide the instructions for how we should move forward in creating a just and peaceful world community.
That was really enlightening and incredible. Thank you so much for sharing so much. Your wealth of knowledge and information is incredible. I have a number of questions that I was hoping to speak to you about. One was a clarification. When you talked about the United Nations, did you actually say that those goals were to be achieved by 2030, as in 30?
Yes.
So when were those goals established? Because it seems like we're at this point 9 years away from that point, and I don't see us as a world community tackling any of those things really, as far as like a coordinated effort is concerned.
And so those goals were established in 2015, and it's supposed to be completed by 2030. And the reason why I wanted to present and share those goals, a lot of people aren't even familiar with those goals. So how is it as a world community we can achieve something if we don't even know what it is that we're trying to achieve?
Right.
The other part of it is, when I read through the goals that they established, I realized that there are things that the Baha'i Faith can offer in helping the world community achieve those goals, which is first and foremost establishing the basic prerequisite to achieving all of that, which is the establishing the change of consciousness, the oneness of humanity. Because when you look at the world today, and all the sort of the things that are on the negative side of things, the destruction of the world today, all of that is based on the ideologies and the belief systems that we have. So in our writings, it also talks about that the reality of man are his thoughts. So our thoughts, our beliefs actually create things. They create our institutions, they create relationships, and so forth. So we want to change the outer circumstances. We must first change our inner circumstances. So the oneness of humanity is the ideology that will then shift and change our outer circumstances. And there's that sort of honest relationship between, the external world and our inner world. And so when we look at the world today, again, as we see all those negative things that are occurring, it's a result of how we're thinking. It's a result of, in this country, the racial hierarchy that we've adopted, and how all of our institutions are creating, disparities for people of color and things of that nature. Right? In order to shift and change all of that, we have to have this conversation. We have to have this belief that all people should be created equal, like single cells in a single body.
So they believed, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this. They believed that in 15 years, we could achieve those sustainable goals by healing those issues of poverty and hunger and pollution, and all 17 of those. They actually believed that.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
And from your point of view, because I would think that it will take us 50 years minimally to be able to achieve those kinds of goals, like maybe in our lifetime, but do you, having the background that you do you believe that it is achievable in such a, in a 15-year period or in the next 9 years?
Right. Yeah. So that's a difficult question to answer, because I think in order to achieve those goals, we have to think about building a new culture.
Yeah.
And I know that the Baha'i Faith is on this path, particularly the last 25 years, of building a new culture. And I can just briefly share that the last 25 years, Baha'is have figured out that there are 4 basic community building goals that need to be achieved, and that can be implemented no matter where you live in the world, no matter what your cultural background. And it began with a question. And the first question was, how are we going to spiritually educate our children? Right? I'm talking about teaching them about a particular orthodoxy of some sort, but how are we going to teach them to be truthful, to be honest, to be loving, to be kind, to be prejudice-free? To respond to this community building need, Baha'is have created children's classes, right? This for the spiritual education of children that are implemented all over the world today. And these are courses operating at the grassroots that are free to anyone, to teach these children the basic fundamentals of being good people and having good character. Because one of the things that we talk about redefining power. Power could be also redefined today as the power of a good character.
Yeah.
Right, the power of good character. Number 2 is, how are we going to spiritually educate our junior youth, those ages 12, 13, and 14, to be able to take all that adolescent energy and be able to direct it in a path that's beneficial to society.
Yeah.
Well, to respond to this community building need, the Baha'is have created what's called the spiritual education or development project for junior youth, right? And this is something that uses an older youth that's kind of facilitating the course and helping youth understand kind of what's going on in the world around them and be able to consult about what's happening within their respective communities and then contribute to the betterment of their communities. And number 3 is, how are we going to take the spiritual energy of prayer and be able to infuse that into our daily interactions with people around us? Well, to respond to this community building need, Baha'is have encouraged prayer meetings and devotional gatherings in any settings that can be very, very diverse. There's an old saying that a family that prays together stays together. Well, in the Baha'i concept, if we are in fact one world community, we're a large family. What is it, 7.5 billion people on the planet today? But we're all one family. And so if we're one family, why not be able to pray with that one family? Yeah. So no matter where you come from religious-wise, as far as your religious background, we are encouraging every society to have people come together in small settings and larger gatherings to say prayers together. And then 4th, how are we going to sustain all of this? So one of the things that Baha'i has done is we've created an institute process to be able to help teach people how to build community from the ground up, dealing with children's class, junior youth groups, prayer meetings, and other ways in which we can build community. And some of the outgrowths of that are like social action, people seeing the needs of their particular area and then taking action. It's really an empowering and a building up of capacity for people. And third is, or actually the second thing rather, from spinning from that is kind of what we're doing today, which is having a social discourse about relevant topics.
Yes.
So these are some elements of community building that Baha'is are sort of instrumental in trying to share with the rest of the world so that we can then build a new culture. And so to answer the question about those sustainable goals, how realistic it is by 2030, I know building culture takes time. It's going to take the development and the sort of reshifting of our thinking, and the time of it is up to humanity. You know, Baha'u'llah is giving everyone a choice. We can either do it the hard way or the easy way through the consultative process, and to acknowledging our spiritual nature.
I love that. I love everything that you've shared because, you know, like you said, the reality of man is his thought. And there is so much negativity that surrounds us and everything that we do. And it's almost like, you know, where we place our energy is where we place our attention. And so, you know, I can look off to the left and I can see all the world's ills and social problems and it'll take me out. Or I can look over to the right and I can see the goodness that's happening in the world. And in every given moment, in every second, I get to choose which way I direct my gaze. And I think we have become as a society very addicted to the emotions of stress, and we look off to the left all the time. Whereas if we're doing that, we don't have an opportunity to build up a new world order that provides for health and happiness and healing for the benefit of all peoples. So we have to be very careful not to get distracted by the disintegration of the old world. Whereas we have to become champions and workers towards the building up of the new world, which is everything that you talked about and shared today. I want to remind everyone that there is an opportunity to write questions below in the questions and answers box. Bob, we are getting wonderful feedback from the presentation today. It was so enriching, and you have a lot of knowledge. So thank you so much for sharing. One of the questions comes, what models exist for coexistence with natural systems in the world societies, especially among Indigenous cultures? Is that something you might be able to speak to?
Yeah, that's a question that I'm gonna have to pass on because I'm not too familiar with what's happening within the Indigenous culture itself.
Yeah, you know, I just spent 10 weeks on Pine Ridge Indian Lakota Reservation and in South Dakota. And I've been giving workshops. I did 18 either half day or full day workshops on historical trauma and healing. And one of the things that I have become very familiar with from the Lakota worldview is the interconnectedness of everything, not just humanity, but the four-legged, the winged, the rocks, the stars, that every single thing is interconnected. And it brings me back to what you talked about the reciprocity of every cell in our body. So, you know, Indigenous cultures have a richness that really provides a foundation for exactly what you're talking about in understanding the interconnectedness of the world and all of humanity and how we must be to survive and thrive. Because we don't want to just survive. We want to really learn how to thrive. And I think the conversation that you took us through today gives us an opportunity to learn how to thrive, because if we put those things into practice, we will thrive as a community. Someone mentioned sustainability goals. You can't hit the top of the trees unless you aim for the stars. That's a really good point. Our dear friend Amelia wrote, man seems unable to correct the problems of his own making. The answer to these ills can only be addressed by a spiritual solution, which you took us through greatly today. Tell us a little bit about your background. You having retired from law enforcement and your understanding of the prison industrial complex. Can you tell us a little more about your own journey through this process and how race plays into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my naive years, in my early 20s, I believe that law enforcement primarily was there to protect and serve. In so many cases, that is the case, right? Protect and serve. So I was drawn to that. And so after receiving my bachelor's degree in psychology, I decided to move into law enforcement as a career. And I did so in a very naive manner. And as I did so, I was struck by some of the things that I was witnessing within my own colleagues and within other agencies that were very racialized. I didn't quite understand what was happening because I didn't have the historical understanding of that. So then while in law enforcement, I began to kind of understand and uncover the history of law enforcement. And I said, and it became key to that understanding. So a lot of people aren't aware, I wasn't aware when I started law enforcement, that the precursor to law enforcement were slave patrols,
Yes.
right? So they started a system of slavery. And if you're going to have a system, you need to have a way to enforce those laws that were set up. And who was enforcing those laws was early precursor. They're called slave patrols. They were people, regular citizens that were assigned to do slave patrols, and basically, since blacks were viewed as property, they were very brutal to how they were treated when they would get out of line or if they would attempt to run and flee from captivity. And then as we move forward, we saw that after the Civil War, we saw black codes come into existence. And these were laws that basically put black folks, because you think about it, after the Civil War, there was the destruction of the South. The complete infrastructure was turned upside down as a result. And so how are they going to rebuild the crumbled South? They came up with what's called black codes. So black people weren't given, any way to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, so to speak. They weren't given any resources, and so a lot of them were vagrants. They didn't have a place to go. They didn't have any resources, so they put it on the books that we're going to make vagrancy a crime, right? And so if you were without a place to go, without anything, that you would be rearrested, put in jail. And they started a convict leasing program during that time. So the saved slave owner who was working you in the fields could then go to a prison jail system, and then take out a number of black folks from there and put them back in the field. And so, and who was enforcing black codes? Law enforcement. And we move up to the Jim Crow laws, right? We saw that who was enforcing Jim Crow laws? It was, again, law enforcement. Who was enforcing some of the unfair ways in which drugs were enforced, particularly in the 70s and all the way up to today, is law enforcement. And so when someone says, well, it's just a few bad apples that are causing these problems within law enforcement, the truth is, when I start uncovering history, is that no, we're talking about 4 centuries of marginalization of black folks, right? And it's from slave patrols to black codes and enforcing Jim Crow laws, and all that is efforts of anti-blackness. That's all that is, anti-blackness. And so we see today the prison industrial complex, which is a pushback from all the gains made in the civil rights of 1964. We talked about that during the presentation, Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So the pushback, so blacks make some gain. That's the history of this country. Because we have not dealt with the root cause of the illness, we keep going. We have this back and forth issue, because we have not dealt with the root cause of it, which was what we're fighting here is not a system. That's an outward expression of the illness. What we're fighting here is an ideology.
Right.
And so I understood that, and as I understood that, it began to make sense to me. So what I'm presently doing, since I've been retired for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working in an educational program for my peers, my police peers, so that they understand the history of law enforcement. So when they stop a black person, and a person may likely get defensive, they may likely be suspicious, may likely be a little nervous, they may run, they may all kinds of things. But as a law enforcement officer, if you understand the history, then you can, instead of being defensive yourself, you can use some de-escalation skills to try to and an understanding about that history.
Wow.
So that's kind of what I've been doing the last several years, and I'm in the process of learning how to engage my law enforcement colleagues, because it's a culture, and it's one that's hard to break through and get them sort of to understand certain aspects of the field because there's a lot there.
Wow, thank you so much for that work. Are you familiar with something called ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences? Have you ever heard of that term before?
I mean, if you can give me an understanding, I had not heard the term, but give me an idea of what it's about. I'd probably be able to share some light
Well,
on.
I think it ties into what you're just talking about, which is why I wanted to bring it up. So in 1995, Kaiser Permanente, in collaboration with the state of California, gave 17,500 adults a test that were in the Kaiser Permanente healthcare family, or system, I should say, and asked 10 questions. And every time you answered yes to one of those questions, you got 1 point. So the questions were, did you have physical, emotional, or sexual abuse in your home? Was there physical or emotional neglect? Was there a parent or a family member who had been incarcerated? Was there a parent or family member who suffered with mental illness? Was there violence in the home? And I'm forgetting the last two at the moment. But what they found was astounding. Of the 17,500 people, anyone with a 4 or higher fell into one of two categories. 100% of those people. 70% of those people had alcohol or drug dependence. 30% of those people had a life-threatening illness that took a minimum of 20 to 30 years off of their lives. So when you were talking earlier about the cells of our body working together, and when there's something that is foreign and isn't supposed to be there, or disease that cancer ravages, so, you know, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, but 100% of those people who suffered any one of these 10 things in childhood, it was called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study. So when you're talking about the history of slavery in our nation, and we don't even have to go back to slavery, we can just talk about the history of the last 150 years with Black codes and slave patrols and Jim Crow laws and the civil rights movement, and even today, just driving while Black, right? That these atrocities, these traumas that impact our community every single day, have long-lasting effects on our bodies and on our psyches. And there, in this study that was done in 1995, you know, 100% of anyone who suffered 4 of these things or more fell into either, you know, I am either dependent on drugs and alcohol because people are self-medicating, or I have developed a life-threatening illness that has taken a minimum of 20 to 30 years off my life. So when we look at the psychological impact that trauma has, we have a lot of work to do in our communities to help heal.
And I just want to kind of add and weigh into what you're sharing is what I would add, that racism itself is a health crisis.
Yes.
For example, when you think about, you know, I talk about in the 70s all the way to now, many of the African-American communities, minority communities, are being unfairly targeted to be put into these private prisons and basic prisons. But what's not considered is the impact, not only on the individual, but impact on the family, particularly the children.
Yeah.
And there's been many studies done on this to talk about how children themselves have been they poor grades, right, and poor relationships with others. There's a great impact on their self-esteem. And oftentimes when the parents is leaving the jail, their child is then entering the jail. This is a, you know, revolving door within families. And the other thing I want to say too about you know, this, you know, health crisis is we oftentimes talk about the Black on Black homicides in our inner cities, and how that internalized racism and pre-existing social factors associated with poverty impact all of that. So there's a lot of healing that has to happen, but I think it starts with acknowledging first and foremost that there is a problem. As I love what Malcolm X said when he said that if a man stabs you in the back and he only pulls a knife out halfway, is that considered progress? And in some cases, they don't even acknowledge the knife is even there.
Right.
So this idea of us acknowledging that our social problems, and particularly around racism being the most vital and challenging issue in this country, first I have to acknowledge that it's real, it exists, that we don't live in a post-racist society, is very, very important to the healing of African Americans all over this country.
One of the things that I often hear from white folks who don't look at racism from a historical perspective is the whole conversation about Black on Black crime, what you just brought up. And I've always had a challenge personally addressing what they're truly saying. Can you address that issue a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. So when you track the history of our inner cities and how our inner cities were even constructed, you have to look at it in a particular perspective. For example, think about the impact of redlining. So from 1934 to 1968, home loans were denied for people of color in these inner cities, right, as an example. And we know that our primary wealth comes from our homes. So now you have these inner cities that are impacted by this whole history. And we know schools are funded by our, the property taxes from homes. So now if you have school systems that don't have the proper resources, right, they call it the school to prison pipeline. Then kids who aren't enforced with good education, with good resources, good teachers, a lot of times those teachers who work in those inner cities are your new teachers who, once they get experience, they leave. So our school systems are poorly funded, and so our inner cities are impacted with lots of crime, lots of drugs. But and people can assume that, oh, it's because you live there, and because you're Black, maybe that's the reason for you not being successful. And so it's like an optical illusion. Well, all I say is the pre-existing social conditions associated with poverty that are creating these things. Now, here's the danger, and they call it colorblind racism. So colorblind racism is a belief that we live in a post-racist society. And if you believe you live in a post-racist society, that means you believe every community, every area of the United States in particular, have equal resources. So we all are on the same starting line. Well, the problem is this: when you see the disparities coming from these institutions, it's easy to conclude that it's a result of someone's skin color, because after all, we all have the same opportunities. And that leads you to this: well, if you're not successful, it's because of your culture, right, your lack of discipline, right, your behavior. Those Black folks will only behave better than they can do better, not realizing that in those inner cities, there are pre-existing social factors that are creating these disparities. So if you truly believe in the oneness of humanity, when you think about institutions creating disparities, you conclude differently. You conclude that, oh, it's the institutions, it's the lack of opportunities that are creating these disparities, not saying, oh, it's because someone's inferior based on their skin color.
Yeah, and what I think most people, or at least most white Americans, don't know is the history that you've talked about here today, and some of the other things, such as you mentioned redlining. Well, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they moved what were the industries, the industry. They moved them out into the suburbs, and Black folks were the major employees of those industries, and they moved them out into the suburbs where Black folks couldn't buy homes. And it was actually like a real estate agent would lose their license if they rented to or sold to a Black family during that time. Or things like, there was a white man who in Chicago, in a western suburb of Chicago, rented an apartment to an African American family who got a job out in one of those mechanical, I don't remember what kind of industry it was, but the Klan burnt his building down, like his apartment building. And the GI Bill, all of the men who went off to fight in World War II, were told, well, when you come back home, you'll have the GI Bill and you'll be able to buy a home for your family. And that happened for white men, but Black men were kept out of that because of redlining and structural institutional racism. So we have all of these things that have been brick after brick after brick that have been saying no, 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 but the majority of white America is not aware of these things, because not only have we been miseducated, but we haven't taken the time to educate ourselves to know something different.
And I just want to say, in a lot of what you're sharing is, you know, in the 13th Amendment, of course, you know, ended slavery, but that ended slavery on paper. We'll make it very clear to people, oh, slavery ended, but it didn't end the ideology that even created slavery in the first place, which was white supremacy, right? This idea that white folks are superior, Black folks are inferior. And then you add the fact that, you know, how Black skin has been racialized, right? So not only to be, initially it was Black folks were viewed as just, you know, sort of inferior to other races. But after the 13th Amendment, because they're trying to rebuild the crumbled South, then the Black skin became criminalized. So now you have a double whammy. You have Black skin being associated with being inferior and being criminalized, and that's still prevalent today. So the illness, like a cancer, has not gone away.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 13th Amendment, in that amendment, it says except for
punishment
or crime, right?
Yes.
So the 13th Amendment, everybody knows that it ended slavery, but I don't think the majority of people know that written into that 13th Amendment, it says except where crime has been committed and it is therefore punishable.
Absolutely.
You can be re-enslaved, basically.
Yes.
Our dear friend Amelia Rose asked a question. She said, when we speak about justice in the West, we do so from a legal perspective. But of the 17 factors that you outlined, where would or should we begin to make a dent in achieving some of these aspects of justice?
So again, you know, justice has been radically redefined today. So in the West, and this is why we can see historical injustices occurring throughout time, and it's part of our law. Like, so they became part of like Supreme Court laws from the past, you know, Plessy versus Ferguson and all of the laws we know that had marginalized people of color. We said that was considered just because why? Because it was part of the law. And so in the West, this concept of justice being people get what they deserve. But if you, as I mentioned earlier, all you got to do is say, well, there are people who are undeserving, undesirables, and therefore you can justify the mistreatment of them.
Right.
And so in the West, we have this sort of false belief system about what justice actually is. Whereas in the Baha'i Faith, justice is viewed like, you know, using the analogy of the body, how every person should be viewed as a trust of the whole, right? Should be able to serve and receive. And when I say receive, there are certain reciprocal things. Everyone should have the right to a good quality education across the board. And so I would say out of all the priorities, I would say education is the great equalizer. Right? Education was the easiest way out of not only racism, it's the easiest way out of poverty.
Yeah.
People don't know, for example, that about the Human Genome Project, right? So from 1990 to 2003, it's supposed to be a 15-year project, but ended up being solving in 13 years, where they basically, a team of international researchers began to sequence the entire human genome to figure out who, you know, what they were trying to solve, issues of disease. But what they discovered was, after 13 years, is that human beings are genetically 99.9% the same. And so that's something that didn't get a whole lot of applause about. So if something happens in this country and it's not noteworthy unless it's something sort of divisive, right? We sort of got into a habit and the appetites of things that are, you know, sensationalized and and very negative. Yeah. That's the materialistic sort of world we live in, where I didn't hear about this until I read about it. But the idea is this: in the Baha'i Faith, it talks about what we need today is teaching the concept of world citizenship, right? So to answer response to the person's question, the number one priority will be education, and presenting this concept about the oneness of mankind and do it in such a way that people can see not just people in the United States, which represent some people across the globe, but worldwide, and concerning ourselves with what's happening worldwide. So you act locally, but you think globally, you know?
Excellent. Bob, thank you so much. Today has been an incredible landscape of not only the world's ills, but the solutions that we can turn towards. And again, there we are. The reality of man is this thought. Where are we going to place our gaze? And we need to know about the ills of the world, but we need to focus on the building up of the solution. So thank you so much for your incredible presentation today and this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We reached our time, but we are so honored to have you again. If you would like accompaniment as far as learning more about the Baha'i Faith, please send an email to info@BahaiChat and put in the subject guide, and we will find someone to accompany you in this process. And definitely go and check out Bob's other conversation on Baha'i Chat and our archives on America's most vital and challenging issue, racism. Bob, it was an honor to share this time with you today. Thank you so much.